So you gave me a good place to start here, Steve, because you mentioned that he's afraid of people being anti-Semitic. Well, Michael Brown brought this up, and it became an issue. I mean, it became something you guys spent time on, and I don't think that it helps this debate. It may be a discussion worth having, but it doesn't help this debate. So here it is.
Seventh, while Steve has categorically and clearly denounced anti-Semitism, there's absolutely no question that the theology he holds to has opened the door to anti-Semitism throughout church history, right to this very day. It's the theology that claims that the church is the new Israel and that no national promises remain for the Jewish people as a whole. It is a theology that fueled the fires of the revered church father John Chrysostom, who in 386 likened the Jewish people to fattened animals who were good for nothing but to be slaughtered. It's the theology that was embraced by the Catholic Church when in 1096, the Crusader armies marched through Europe with the slogan, "Kill a Jew, save your soul," offering their Jewish neighbors baptism or death, even burning them alive in their synagogue.
So, exactly what you said, he brought up anti-Semitism. Now, we all agree, Steve, that nobody should be anti-Semitic, but I'd like for you to comment on it because it took up part of your debate, and he said that this does not apply to you, and it's not really furthering this discussion.
Yeah. Well, yeah, he thinks there's sort of a causal relationship between supersessionism, which is the better name for what he's calling a replacement theology. Supersessionism is the view that the new covenant has superseded the old covenant. Now, to my mind, that shouldn't even be controversial. The New Testament's very plain on that. Hebrews brings that up very carefully, that where there's a new covenant, the old one's obsolete. So there's been, many times there's things in the New Testament about how the old covenant is done away. There's a new covenant based on better promises and so forth. But but the way that someone like Dr. Brown, I mean, people of his view, typically understand supersessionism is that they say the church has replaced Israel. Well, that's not exactly true, because Israel, the faithful Israel in the Old Testament, were the church, always have been the church. And the church in the New Testament was the faithful of Israel. It was thousands and thousands of Jewish Christians before there were any Gentile ones. And they were simply the Jews who accepted the Messiah. That's the church. And then Gentiles were added to them, just like Gentiles were added to the Jews in the Old Testament. I mean, Ruth and Rahab were Gentiles. They became part of Israel. In the Old Testament, a Gentile could become part of Israel by simply being faithful to the covenant. And it's just that in the New Testament, you become Israel by being faithful to the new covenant, because the new one has superseded the old. So the people who are faithful to God and his covenant are the true Israel. And it's always been the case that the founding members of that group, whether in the Old or the New Testament, were Israel by race. But it's always been possible for Gentiles to also become part of that, and if they want to be faithful to the covenant. So the new covenant was made with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, it says in Jeremiah 31, and that the representatives of that group were the apostles in the upper room when Jesus said, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood." But eventually Gentiles were added to that group, and that's what we call the church. But see, Israel in the Old Testament was called the church also. In the Septuagint, the ecclesia, the church in the Greek, was used of Israel in the Old Testament, and used of the new covenant Israel in the New Testament, which is us. Now, the thing is that believing that doesn't have any bearing on anti-Semitism. This is a category error. Anti-Semitism is racism. Anti-Semitism is hatred for people of a certain race because of their race, namely Jewish race. But supersessionism doesn't say anything negative about people of the Jewish race or any other race. In fact, unlike Dr. Brown's position, supersessionism teaches there's no distinction between any race. The Jew, the Gentile, Irish, black, white, red, yellow, doesn't matter what color you are, what race you are, what nationality. In God's sight, all people are equal, and all unbelievers who rebel against God are equal to each other, whether they're Jew or Gentile. And all faithful people are equal in God's sight, whether they're Jew or Gentile. God doesn't judge people on racial lines anymore. Now, Dr. Brown, he labors to point out that he's not saying Jews are superior to other people. He's just saying this is not a matter of racism. It's a matter of God's faithfulness to keep his covenant. But his covenant was always to those only who are faithful. And he made that statement again and again in the Old Testament. It's obvious in the New Testament too, that if you have faith in God, if you follow Christ, you're one of God's people. Doesn't matter if you're a Jew or Gentile. And if you reject Christ, if you're rebellious against God's covenant, then you're on bad terms with God. And it doesn't matter if you're a Jew or Gentile. So the New Testament view, which is supersessionism, does not say anything bad about Jewish people per se. Now, it is true that when we think of anti-Semite, or when we think of Jew, even the word Jew, you might think of a person who's got racial ancestry going back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which is one way of defining Jewish, is racially or ethnically. But also, ever since Mount Sinai and Moses, being part of Israel, or being later on they were called Jews, simply had to do with a religion called Judaism. Now, actually, the religion that Moses mediated at Mount Sinai was never called Judaism, because the people weren't called Jews at that time. After they came back from Babylon, they were called Jews. And but they later on, of course, after the temple was destroyed, they couldn't even follow Old Testament religion anymore, because you can't have Old Testament religion without a temple and without sacrifices. So rabbis formed what is now called Judaism, which is rabbinism, or what the rabbis teach. It's called Talmudism, and it's a very anti-Christian religion. I mean, no more or less so than, let's say, Hinduism or Buddhism. Maybe a little more so than those. Actually, Islam is less anti-Christian than Judaism. Judaism is more anti-Christian than Islam, because Islam says very good things about Jesus. Islam believes Jesus is the greatest prophet in history, just not the Son of God. So they don't see him correctly, but they still think highly of him. But the Talmud speaks evil of Jesus, calls him a deceiver, a seducer, a sorcerer, illegitimate child. And I mean, these are terms the Talmud uses. So clearly Talmudism, or which is called Orthodox Judaism today, they have negative things to say about Jesus more than most other religions do. But so, I mean, when you quote John Chrysostom, or Michael Brown quotes him, or even Luther, both of those men said very harsh things against what they called the Jews. And therefore, these are prime examples that Zionists like to give of how supersessionism, or replacement theology, causes anti-Semitism, because all Christians from the Apostles' age until fairly modern times were supersessionists. I mean, even people like Dr. Brown and people who hate replacement theology, they admit that replacement theology was the view of the early church as far back as we know to go. The early church fathers were vocally supersessionists. Justin Martyr being one of the most outspoken on, but several church fathers made that clear. So these people, Chrysostom was a supersessionist, Luther was supersessionist, but they both made very anti-Semitic remarks. But here's something that we have to remember, because we're in a very different situation than they are. When we're thinking of Jews, we're probably thinking of ethnic Jews, people who are, descended from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And no Christian I know has anything against them. I mean, there are racists, there are anti-Semites who hate anyone who's got Jewish blood and so forth. But that wasn't the position of Chrysostom or Luther. They were against the Jewish religion, which was a blasphemous religion against Christ. And in a country, Europe in those days was Christian. I mean, officially, it's not like you had freedom of religion back then. You had to believe the religion of your prince, and you were either Protestant or Catholic if you're in Western Europe. And it was a state religion. And therefore, if you've got an anti-Christian religious group living among you, then seeing them as rebelling against Christ brought forward some pretty immoderate language. But neither Chrysostom nor Luther would have had any criticism of a Jewish person who became a Christian. In other words, they're not against the Jewish race. They're against the Jewish religion because it's an anti-Christian religion. Now, I don't think that Luther or Chrysostom were right to make the remarks they made, but I don't believe they're right to think that there's such a thing as a state religion either. I think that was just a mentality. If you go against your state religion, it's like being a traitor to your country. So you do find people in that situation saying really negative things about the Jews, but they're not thinking of them as Jews strictly by race, because any Jew who became a Christian, and there were many who did, were accepted. No one had anything against them. And if a Gentile had become a Jew by faith, they would have come under the same criticism from Luther and so forth, because he was against the anti-Christian religion called Judaism. And so that's what's hard. You can say, well, these people are anti-Semite. What do you mean anti-Semite? They weren't racially against the Jewish race, although in those days, probably 99% of the Jewish race were of the Jewish religion too. So in many people's minds, they probably didn't distinguish them. But it's very clear that it wasn't the race, but the religion of the Jews that these church fathers spoke against. Now, I would also speak against the religion of the Jews, but we live in a time where in America, we've cut our teeth on the idea of religious tolerance and, freedom of religion. So, there could be an atheist, or there could be a Buddhist or a Jew or a Muslim, and we're not going to lambaste them unless they do evil things. But I mean, we allow that people can have other religions, but that was not the case in Europe in the time of Luther or Chrysostom. They were living in Christian Europe, and they didn't have freedom of religion. And the idea that someone could be a non-Christian and that's okay, without them being disloyal or whatever to the country, was not it was not part of their mental furniture back then.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's why I say that talking about that in the debate just doesn't help it. I mean, how are you going to explain all that without taking that much time in a debate that's really just about what does the Bible say about the promises and about the fulfillment? Yeah. And that's why I think it's just a red herring, and he absorbed time with it. So, yeah, he even said...
Let me just say this. There's an exact parallel in the way modern leftism talks. All they have to do is call you racist. And it doesn't matter what they object to about you. If they use the word racist, suddenly you're set back on your heels. You've got to defend yourself. Say, I'm not a racist, blah, 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 blah. And it just takes you off goals. It's like during the Black Lives Matter movement. If somebody in that movement asked you, do you believe Black Lives Matter? If you said all lives matter, they called you a racist. And It's like this. We say all races are the same, Jew and Gentile, and they call you a racist. They call you anti-Semite. It's just the very same thing as saying all lives matter and being called a racist for saying that.
Yeah, that's right. And at one point I liked how you said something, because he kept saying, well, maybe you don't have to be an anti-Semite if you believe what Steve believes, but it opens the door. And you said, well, just don't go through the door. I mean, it's that simple. I mean, just don't be anti-Semitic.